I'm not even going to think about it too much before I start recording this response to Sam Vaknin's video about what's it called? Normal question mark, mentally ill question mark, not in my culture exclamation mark. So I mean, this is a very interesting video, and I mean, I guess he made this video to be somewhat provocative, at least slightly. That essentially the field is in a kind of um, an inexorable relativism, which makes it completely shaky. And there are and technically he is correct in terms of looking at psychology as a historical um, field, or as the historical record of psychiatry and psychology, which is a hideous account of many perverse things. But and then are we really just looking at everything with a new moral framework, and therefore and as the moral framework alters, how do these things look differently? Now I'm going to, I think, obviously perhaps in an impudent and a conceited way, I'm going to describe the end of this road. I'm going to describe essentially how we jettison that horrible paradoxical paradigm, because I mean the problem which Sam Vaknin is framing in this video is that essentially psychology to a large extent is indistinguishable from witchcraft, actually. And I mean this quite specifically because to put a diagnosis on someone is very similar to being able to cast a spell on someone. That if you can put a diagnosis on someone, and then the courts are going to treat them differently, they're going to filter their own testimony, so psychology has to mean something at some point. Otherwise, we are going to I mean, look, and psychology in the legal framework has always been slightly problematic, and this is generally because most courts that I'll say have civilized um, principles and elements to their procedure, uh, they generally have a rule against character assassination. They do not allow character assassination, um, so that the court can essentially come to its own finding on veracity and measuring evidence. And this is also why there's a general rule against substituting the expertise of the judicial officer, or the presiding judicial officer, for another expertise which should be kept under the judicial process and part of the judicial um, uh, uh, elaboration, because it is the gaps in the judicial process which therefore require law to be developed, and for the process of law to unfold and elaborate. Um, and this has also a special significance in a kind of in an open liberal democratic framework as well, especially one in which or in the Roman Dutch legal system, which is why I say that my legal system is superior to basically all other legal systems, is because the common law develops via the controversy in the court, and the common law, as it's adjudicated by the presiding judicial officer, can be more important than legislation. It can trump legislation. And that doesn't and so in some sense the morality of individuals and how they are adjudicated in the court process can create new law, that essentially your actions in a particular controversy can have a universal ramification in developing the law, and your moral standard and your moral integrity in how you conducted yourself can become essentially um, an enlightening force, that via the court your higher morality is magnified in some sense, and it's not overridden by Parliament. It This is the very special hybrid legal system that we have in my country, South Africa, um, which has the Roman Dutch system, where we have immutable general principles, and the application of those general principles and the elaboration of those general principles into how they should be imported and influential and pertinent to particular controversies, and so essentially it's all about sorting out these principles, and the principles are immutable, but there are enough of them, and they are canonical, and they are uh, uh, and because they are general principles, they have a kind of cogency, they have a consistency, they have a re you know they resonate very much with responsible actorship. And so often, when you have comported yourself correctly enough in a novel enough circumstance, your action frames what is almost a form of public policy, which is promulgated by the courts, um, in issuing precedent over legal decisions and legal questions. Anyway, and you can see very badly how the so-called expertise of psychologists could intervene and disrupt that delicate and important societal organ from processing what it needs to process, from digesting what it needs to digest, in order to issue um, pronouncements and declarative positions as to what the law is and what the law means. Um, Innovations over those legal issues uh, um, that are unfolded and developed through this common law process. If a psychologist steps in and says, no, 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 I've got some diagnoses to describe what's going on here, to describe large parts of what's going on here, and these must always be taken very slowly by the courts, to not take them as authoritative, but to digest what the psychologist might have to offer into the legal, um, the grounded, sort of the general principles of the matter, and then seeing how what the psychologist is really saying, and how it obviously is filtered through the legal conceptualization of what's going on. Because there are many people who can be described by psychologists as being psychotic, but who are still legally accountable and legally um, competent, that they have not essentially lost their oh my word, I can't believe I've forgotten this piece of jargon. Uh, I can't remember what the jargon is, the legalese, but they haven't lost their. It's not their. It's um, their power of. That their decisions are legally are imbued with that their decisions have a binding legal oh my word, what the hell is it called, that they I mean okay, well, the actual, I can only remember the most basic sort of legal construct here, which is that they can still act legally, that their actions are legally ascribed to their person, um, uh, that their personality is robust enough and vital enough to create legal consequences that they're not um, effectively ignored, or their consent is not overridden, essentially, by dismissing their legal, oh my word, I can't remember what it is, their legal authority, their legal standing. I can't remember. Anyway, that's embarrassing. Let me just move on. So it would be like this is not the right construct, but it would be like the power to give your legal consent, the power to grant your legal consent to something. I can't remember what that's called, but anyway, oh, this is going to bug me, but okay, let me just move on. So the important thing about the about disabusing ourselves of this relativism, and I mean, sadly, this this can only be sorted out by a society or a community or a civilization or a nation that has an effective philosophical framework that is robust enough to sort of contain this kind of complexity. And sadly, there are not many nations that measure up to this high standard. South Africa is definitely one of them because its constitutional design and its constitutional edifice, as it exists in relation, I mean, it's the most modern and advanced state that exists. Canada brought out a constitution later than South Africa, but their nation state is like a clown. It's like a circus. It's like a Napoleonic nightmare. You know, it's just as corrupt as the French Revolution, as far as I can tell. You know, it's in form it has slightly better window dressing than obviously the French Revolution. But anyway, um, like in terms of the integrity of how things are framed and founded, it's just it's a nightmare. Um, South Africa, as far as I can tell, is sort of the gold standard because it actually it uh, articulates everything just where it should be, and everything is nicely framed. Britain should also probably be commended for its de facto sort of framework, but that's problematic because it's sort of it's like a living culture, as it were. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that thing. Uh, Look, on the political side, I think the American system has a lot of virtue, but on the legal side of how the American legal system functions, I think it's just as problematic because it's fundamentally Napoleonic. That it all rests on the authority and somewhat the paternalism that the plenary has upon society. So it's like the congresses, even the state congresses and senates, are like the parents of those states, and that I find quite disgusting. It doesn't have quite the same framework that I just described in terms of how individuals can essentially reframe the law by leveraging legal principles essentially, and using those legal principles uh, um, to effectively create what effectively becomes sort of common law powers which exist as they are acted into being, and then they are defended in the courts post hoc. So the right is not created beforehand by the plenary, but by a parliament a or by a congress or a senate. Uh, it's uh, it's vindicated in court, but it's already established, as it were. And so the sort of the right of the individual is much more expansive and creative, or even one could say artful in such a way. And so it's a much more vibrant um, distribution of power, in which, like the American Bill of Rights, I would say, is horribly legally constructed, because when you are given absolute rights, you might as well be given almost no. I mean, there are very few examples in which this right, the absolute rights in the Constitution have the citizens of America have been cheated, because they've been given these pristine absolute rights, which are effectively not protected, because it's impossible to protect absolute rights perfectly. So the whole thing is just is a bit of a con almost. It is a so I mean, you have the right to the pursuit of happiness. Well, does that mean that you can stop paying your taxes because your taxes stop you from pursuing your happiness? No, because the rights are interpreted to be commensurate with the power of the state. So, I mean, what good are they? How can you call that a fair adjudication on that issue? When you have such watered down rights, and then your only comeback is, well, at least they're absolute. Well, how absolute are they then? Really. I mean, this is a technical semantic game. You just have to come up with any clever rationalization, and you can trounce the right. You can quash the right effectively, in whatever practical way that your clever semantics and rationalization can come up with. This is why I say it's just a bit of a nightmare. But I mean, anyway, it makes people care about politics to some degree, and that's perhaps not too terrible. Anyway, but there are better ways of having a legal system. Anyway, okay, so the South African, uh, what was I getting into? Okay, yeah, so you have to have a clear enough structure of what's going on in order to not fall into this trap that Sam Vaknin is describing. Um, Now, the South African, I'm going to make a kind of a general, a very sort of general, aggregated sort of statement, and it's just going to help me make my point a lot faster. Uh, but basically, the Bill of Rights in the South African Constitution, and combined with how the law is framed and things like that, I'm just going to sort of fast forward um, and not substantiate this perfectly, but essentially, it really contains a kind of a way of thinking that is the only way of thinking that real liberalism can actually perpetuate an open democratic society. And so you can see all the rights in the Bill of Rights are are kind of relativistic, um, are described sort of relativistically, that people have the right to access. They don't have a right to something, they have the right to access something. And so, where does that access come from? Well, then the government just has to make sure that things are open enough, that things are running smoothly enough, and that if someone doesn't have access to something, then that's a problem that government is saddled with having to ameliorate whatever the obstacle is. So it's sort of, government has to look for obstacles, and even the citizenry can compel the government, which would be even easier to do if they could actually, if the case made against the government could outline a very simple kind of solution, and then sort of say, well, this wouldn't be too much, and this right is quite important, and government could just do this to help people gain access. So why don't they just do that? So you can sort of, but it's sort of, it keeps responsibilities where they should be, duties where they should be, a kind of vigilance or whatever. But okay, what I'm really trying to say is, and this doesn't connect so well with what I've just said, but you can kind of see it in the way of the thinking, in some sense, that we're trying to create as much of a permissive society as possible to get so that people can, in some sense, um, yeah, this is kind of the same thinking, but it's kind of in a completely different vogue. Um, that culturally, the way to have a free society, the maximum sort of freedom and the maximum responsibility inculcated into its citizenry, is to have a permissive society, is to not take on a kind of authoritarian role in which you are socially engineering positive outcomes using the power of the state, but you are permitting people even to harm themselves, so that culturally there will be a kind of an awareness of essentially what would be prevented by imposing social engineering and by trying to protect people from themselves or from other people, that essentially you're trying to get culture to police itself in some sense, and you're not trying to use the power of the state to supposedly enhance the security of people, because then in the long term, you don't actually generate a kind of a firm kind of solution. So I think, in anyway, this is my that general formula gives you at least an outline of how I see psychology functioning. That it doesn't have to be prescriptive. It can just accumulate knowledge objectively, as it were. And this, I think, has and then, to the extent to which that homosexuality could have been classified as a pathological manifestation of some kind of syndrome or something like that, that there must be research in psychoanalysis or in some kind of psycho. I mean, never mind the treatment, which I'm sure was barbaric, but in terms of the actual understanding of the structure of whatever it is as a psychological manifestation. Um, and I know for a fact that there is a lot of literature that gets into um, developmental aspects and things like that. And I mean, I've even elaborated myself where I see the structures in the inner child that precipitate what I mean. I, it's hard to even say these things because they sound so pejorative, but there are elements of it which, to me, seem very clearly uh, a form of sort of, I guess I'll just loosely describe it as a sort of inverted narcissism. Um, but there are also, there's not just one species of homosexuality. So, I mean, from a psychological standpoint. But anyway, these are things that should not just be thrown away and jettisoned because, oh, society is now permissive of these things. Um, because, well, I mean, those are things that could be useful in terms of any kind of therapy or of self-actualization. I mean, you don't have to have it as your goal to cure the homosexuality. That it doesn't, to understand homosexuality as a psychological phenomena. I don't see why these things are, like, it's, that it's either in the DSM or it's not part of psychology. I don't that doesn't That's a non sequitur. um, so there's that. And I would just say that, in the same way that we can understand that permissiveness is is not an antidote to indicating or to having something been labeled, so in the same way that you could, I mean, I this is more of a kind of this is a sort of a political argument, but in the same way that I think that I'm very sympathetic to the arguments about cultivating a culture of life, uh, which can even include, like the idea that drug use is very damaging and bad for people. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't think that it would be better if drugs were legal, because it's the criminalization of drugs which in some sense focus so much money into that industry. If you just decriminalized the whole industry completely, and in fact even helped to set up sort of pharmaceutical companies to sort of create recreational, and sort of try to control it, and yes, perhaps you would be sending some people to their graves, um, perhaps some people that would have died anyway. But that, you see, to say that you could make something legal, but that it can still be culturally taboo, that you can permit something but still have it as a cultural taboo. This is this is the juxtaposition which I think is the holy grail of having a mature, responsible culture and society. And it might be that it has a kind of teething, um, it goes through sort of a teething phase where right at the start, that paradox is a bit hard for people to sort of to get to grips with, as they sort of move their locus of control from a kind of from the external authority of what is legal into an internal judgment, which their opinion is part of culture, and that we as a society should should be culture centric. We shouldn't be huddled around the authority of the state, and to develop an independent culture that is not under the infantile, sort of overshadowing that the state provides. Uh, so I see that as a very important novation that is needed at some point in order for us to reclaim a sense of ownership of even our humanity, because right now the culture and the politics, I think, is certainly toxic and corrupt. But and I've often said that I believe that this is a consequence of Napoleonic law. That when you have a Napoleonic style of how your state is crafted, that the Parliament, that the Congress, that the Senate creates law that is above people's heads, and that they are always below it, and that it doesn't matter what arguments they might make in court, they can't change the law. They can't have laws overturned because they can make a stronger argument, a stronger reasoned based argument, based on general principles. There's no resources that you have in law against what was validly passed by your Napoleonic styled state. That, to me, is the death of an internal locus of control that sort of eventually, I think that's what we are saddled with today. It's sad that this fad has reached South Africa, because South Africa had always had a better legal framework. It always had a better structure in its state. I mean, it was so better that even the apartheid government was overruled by the High Court. Um, in many occasions, was curtailed by and reprimanded by the courts. The courts were above Parliament essentially. In the because the legal system was so robust, and I mean, obviously, there wasn't that much in the Roman law that could actually completely defeat apartheid from the inside. That was fixed with the Constitution of the New South Africa, which added, uh, which essentially adapted the common law and added new rights and new values and effectively new general principles to the common law, um, as as essentially affected by the rationale which the Constitution um, elaborates. Anyway, I'm saying a lot of things. So yeah, so obviously, in some sense, then I think that there needs to be some distinctions that are made within psychology in order to orientate itself, that it can still accumulate knowledge about the psyche, about people's minds, and not have this kind of this shaky relativism, um, of always sort of, and this I think just means like, don't, uh, you know, there has to be distinctions between psychological conditions that have legal consequences and psychological conditions that, and when I say legal consequences, I mean consequences in terms of people's status, in terms of their ability to accrue accountability. I mean, oh, that's obviously a very important distinction. Like does certain conditions obviate someone's legal responsibility in a particular matter? Okay, no, let me just move around this issue a bit, because I'm not talking to the issue that I wanted to talk to, which was that, yeah. So I mean, I find it quite disgusting that that the DSM. I mean, it's quite disgusting that even in the APA, the American Psychological Association, has said a whole lot of stuff about toxic masculinity, and I mean that, as far as I can tell, is a borderline takeover, an ideological takeover of the APA, sort of trying to create a kind of a safe space for borderlines in order to kind of reify their uh, enabling enabling narratives, and sort of to set the scene for them to be able to play their kind of their game, in which trust itself becomes a kind of whack-a-mole, where they can sort of dilute the notion of trust into a kind of collective responsibility for culture, and then under that weird kind of conflation of a complaint, that they can complain that people are part of this systemic condition and force, and so then you can just easily set people up as symbolic representatives of this scapegoat boogeyman of toxic masculinity, and set themselves up as the victims of some kind of perpetrated slight against their ideological claim, in which they deserve to get what they feel entitled to, based um, on their subjective interpretation of this ideological narrative, and this sort of where they can color anyone's actions as either being answerable to a kind of a false dilemma interpretation, where either the action was sort of trying to assert a kind of toxic dominance, or claim a kind of a special superiority, or uh, or that they just need to be educated about their insidious undermining of people uh, uh, who don't want to live. Because I mean, it's weird because it's like the whole ideological narrative of toxic masculinity is that we live in a fake matrix that was designed by men. So it's sort of like, it's this weird kind of, cultural authoritarianism that describes its enemy as an authoritarian, and they have to prove the negative before they can escape. Even, like, you don't even listen to what they have to say until they can prove the negative. That they have to prove that they're not a toxic male before you even hear what's coming out of their mouth. You don't, you can just ignore it, and you can just reduce it into toxic masculinity. This is also what happens when they use this fake psychological language of calling people phobic, that they're homophobic or transphobic. You have to prove that you're not afraid before even what you say can be taken with any, sort of you don't deal in positive reasons, because you have to first excuse yourself as not being phobic. So, it's this weird shift of the burden of proof is always exported, by this weird kind of borderline narrative, which sets themselves up as always this kind of, this naive and innocent, sort of sensitive uh, uh, victim that has been intruded upon, and that cannot be held responsible or accountable for the destination that they wish to get to, because they have been derailed by the systemic obstacle, which people have to take a kind of collective responsibility for, as subjectively apportioned by them. And you see, essentially, that means that trust doesn't exist. Trust is for them to accuse someone of essentially not taking their version of events as being holy writ. So it's sort of, it's a way to sort of elevate their argument into a default orthodoxy that they just assert, that they just assume. And so that they can be as subversive and destabilizing as they so wish, because they can just say, well, I'm not satisfied, I'm not happy. Never mind, like, they never have to give a tangible alternative. They never have to say, well, let's just do this instead, and how, and get into a discussion about their alternative. No, they're not happy to issue alternatives. They're like, no, you come up with an alternative, because I'm just being victimized. It's that kind of hysterical escalation. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, you could center society around that kind of borderline tactic, that kind of borderline baiting of people into a narrative. And all that really means is that you live in a fascist society. I mean, that's the same kind of culture that the Nazis had. When you create these ideological boogeymen and scapegoat. Um, okay, did I cover everything that I wanted to cover? I mean, I understand that this whole sort of argument is a bit embarrassing, but But yeah, I think that essentially psychology should just sort of depathologize itself in some sense and give itself the leeway to. I mean, I have read descriptions of homosexuality in old psychological literature, and I could tell that it was very, it's not describing nothing, it's describing real structures, it's describing real psychological structures. um, and if psychology wants to maim itself in order to because all it does is record so-called pathologies instead of just understanding structures in the mind. I mean, I guess the problem is thinking that psychology has a kind of has a stable parallel to condemnation, and I guess, like I agree that psychology in some sense will never be a science, but um, it could certainly make itself more stable and, let's say, timeless, and also more rigorous in a kind of movement towards um, trying to create a kind of universal language. I mean, in some sense, the only things that perhaps should be pathologized are, or I mean, or that should have perhaps pejorative language mixed in with descriptions, are are ones in which you are getting into territory that sort of has a kind of gray area within certain legal terminology or certain legal jurisprudence. So you should have to track those things more carefully. But I mean, obviously, the problem in personality theory or personality disorders is that I mean, in some sense, the no personality disorder is by itself illegal. Uh, I mean, I guess to me, I don't worry about, let's say, pathologizing homosexuality because I already pathologized 99.99999% of so called normal personality. To me, it's all the false ego complex. So I don't give a damn if a particular false ego happens to present as also having a homosexual sexuality, and another person false ego complex supposedly has a heterosexuality. I don't That's just another label, that's just another layer or another tag. It's irrelevant to me because I already pathologize what is considered ordinary. So to me, it doesn't. I don't really give a damn. Um, the idea that you have this DSM book of bad labels, is just. I mean, that's obviously the problem then that psychology has is it needs to. I mean, it's not a Bible. Like, what the hell is it? I mean, we all know historically what the DSM is. I mean, it was made for insurance companies. I mean, this is, we're already on a level of intellectual destitution. um, and now already you're going to sort of jettison large parts of psychological research and accumulated knowledge just because it becomes sort of unfashionable, uh, in terms of what society finds normatively acceptable. In that it's created new prejudices against the acquisition of certain knowledge. In the same way that essentially you couldn't look into, you're not allowed to make pronouncements about transsexual psychology because you might be exacerbating um, uh, people's suicide or something like that. I mean, it's just it's a bit crazy, that, well, I mean, it's certainly sort of absurd to think that, that you're going to have censorship in terms of the promulgation of psychological understanding because of a heightened sense. I mean, psychology has really done itself a huge disservice. I mean, the question that I always ask is how is the APA going to fix its reputation? Even if the APA renounces all of this toxic masculinity bullshit, how is it going to actually account for itself? It's already kind of showed that the field itself is just. Sorry, I'm trying to remember something because I wrote about this recently to a friend of mine. I mean, the APA has already proven that the field is so weak that it can be used as a Trojan horse for ideological capture and promotion. Uh, how will the APA regain its reputation? It's like the Nazi sciences. Whatever the ideology needs is provided for by people with white lab coats. Uh, like how is it going to give an account of how it has, how is the APA going to make an account of its complicit mediocrity, into all of this fashionable I, I, identity politics bullshit. Um, and I guess it really has found the hole in the armor of psychology, because I guess this was the worst aspect of psychology. This is what made it look the most flimsy, is that in the sense of how things get radically reviewed according to some sort of latest normative prejudice or interest but I mean I've always explained this, that psychology has always had too many low quality intellects, too many flunked doctors trying to obtain high status by mimicking any fashionable meme going around the academy. But also, I mean, psychology is one of the hardest. It is the hardest field. It requires the most intelligence to make real ground in. Um, but I think the reason why the subject has not been able to make progress is it requires a concerted commitment in specialization in order to refine it. And people don't have the tenacity to do that kind of work in order to theorize deeply enough and research as a kind of networked project in order to get anywhere. You need a certain kind of flagrant, kind of commitment to testing out a kind of a specialized, you know, um, interpretation or framework, and see how far that gets you, in order to synthesize things. Um, it wants to make sort of incremental work, and you can't really make. You could probably make incremental work within a very specialized, sort of theoretical framework, but without the requisite theorizing, psychology is not something that is going to be uncovered slowly. It's going to be uncovered. 90% of it is going to be uncovered at one time, and then the details are going to come. Some of the details that need to be filled out are going to be filled in afterwards. That's how it's going to come. Um, the bones are going to all be discovered, like 90% of the bones are going to be discovered at once, and then it's going to take a long time to piece together all how the sinew and the muscle and the flesh on the bones. But um, but people can't even see what the bones are. They don't even know what the bones look like. They're so fucking mesmerized by bullshit. um and that is sadly because, I mean, I think that they don't have high enough IQs, generally speaking. I mean, and even some of the high IQ ones are just completely mesmerized by bullshit. Um, they just don't have deep enough intellects. They might be good at solving IQ puzzles, but they're not good at understanding things conceptually. They just don't have the theoretical depth in them to even gauge things. You know, uh, uh, it's kind of like, you know just very weak philosophical. Uh, which, I mean, is, I guess, it's easy to be mesmerized by sort of mediocre philosophical sentiments because there's so many mediocre sentiments that fuel the academy in general. Um, because obviously there's a lot more interesting things to get into in terms of the hard sciences, but in terms of the theoretical aspect to it, people don't even understand how weak the basic philosophy underlying the hard sciences are, and how to actually relate that into how reason, you know, um, and well, when I say reason, I meant more epistemology. How and this is the thing, is that the thing that is actually needed to synthesize these things is developments in psychology, which it really needs to understand itself as being the queen of the sciences, as being above, uh, in a sense, philosophy and the hard sciences. But sadly, these are just flunked doctors who are trying to attain or, I mean, I'm generalizing, obviously, flunked doctors that are trying to acquire high status by mimicking whatever fashionable thing comes along. Okay, I mean, this was horribly argued, but I think I outlined the main thrust of my resolution to this problem that Sam Vaknin is talking about. Um, is make technical indicators within descriptions of conditions and syndromes that have pejorative correlation to legal, to how they might impinge in certain legal matters or legal questions, but otherwise just completely destigmatize the canon of psychology. This idea that people are going to focus on, you're only going to treat something that society deems. I mean that's the problem, is that you can't ground things like that. You can't say, well, we only treat conditions, and conditions are defined by society. I mean, you can't do that. I mean, in some sense, the only way to make psychology independent is to, I guess what it needs is it needs an ethical, framework. It needs an ethical outline. Um, it needs its own sort of general principles of how to um, think about the structures and the constructs that it discovers and that it talks about, or that have been studied. And it needs to perhaps open up study to things that aren't, to things that are considered benign. So essentially the inclusion of, because in some sense then it doesn't matter if it's a benign syndrome or a pathological syndrome or something like that, or if it's a benign structure or a pathological structure. Why does it matter? Why do you even have to put the moral language or the moral layer on top of it? And then you can understand that there are structures which are socially problematic. I mean, maybe that's the reason why we can't, or we don't even have good tools to deal with things, because the same species of that thing exists as a benign construct, or a benign mechanism, and because that one's a sacred cow and we can't look at it deeply enough, we don't know how to ameliorate the pathological contortion of the same species of structure. So just sort of just destigmatize the ethical um, uh, mandate of the researcher and perhaps even the clinician, and work out a kind of a liberally grounded way of. I mean, this might be tricky because in some sense, well, I mean, obviously there's still going to be a plethora, but of choices and things like that. But perhaps there should be some kind of protocol of dialogue, because if psychologists or clinicians, let's just say, were forced into at least particular protocols because they were observing certain, let's say, almost a higher degree of ethical consistency, that perhaps you would even achieve greater therapeutic um, outcomes. In the same way that there's a very clever trick when in DBT, when you're treating a borderline, or I mean DBT is not just for borderlines, but if you are treating a borderline, they use this all the time. They basically they say to the patient, "Do you want an effective treatment?" I can't remember what the other alternative is, or because if I have to deal with you threatening to commit suicide, then we have to deal with that, and then I can't give you the effective. So you have to agree not to threaten or to commit suicide. You have to promise me that you won't, because then I can give you the effective treatment. So constantly propositioning the patient to control the course of the therapeutic, to have a hand over handling the course of the therapeutic process. Um, I mean, that was just meant to be a small example, but essentially, if there was a protocol in terms of generating a diagnosis via the consent of the patient, that you might have a much more stable construct or formulation of what even the structure that the patient has is, and then you would also have a more tangible, um, so if there were protocols in place to sort of I mean, obviously, I'm talking very generally, and this is not going to work for every circumstance. But in some sense, if you're sort of educating the patient to the point at which that they can sort of uh, consent to their diagnosis, so it's a joint diagnosis that is precipitated. It's part of a sort of a dialogue that you might get a much better sort of prognosis that's that doesn't fall prey to what I complained about earlier in this recording, where essentially psychologists are like witches because they just cast spells on people, they cast diagnoses on people. That we don't sit, because I mean, that is because that isn't just a problem for the court. At the end of the day, the reason why it's a problem for the court is because it's an affront somewhat to the integrity. It's a blind uh, it's to blindsight the integrity. It's to sort of, and it's also sort of to authoritatively blunt the efficacy of the individual as well. It's very disempowering. Um, so I mean, there are a lot of aspects in psychology that can probably be revamped, restructured. Um, I mean, obviously, there's something like expertise, but maybe clinically, what people need is a form of elaborated expertise that is not essentially fitting the patient into a new modus of a kind of what is actually quite a subversive externalization of sort of authority and control, which maybe what clinicians do is fine for some problems, and it's completely the worst thing in the world for other problems like personality disorders. And uh, I mean, the first thing we have to regard when Sam Vaknin is making this provocative video about the state of psychology or the relativism in psychology is we have to understand just how weak psychology is. Like, even just how bad it is, just how poor it is, how the state of the field is not good. Like, it's just isn't. you know and like, honestly, you think about psychiatry 100 years ago, you think about psychiatry 50 years ago, it's like a horror story. It's literally a horror story, not even like metaphorically, it's literally a horror story. And I'm telling you now, when we get further along in psychology, we will say the same thing about today. It is still a horror story. And people don't want to do radical revision, and it is indicated. It's a bad field. It's a poor field. It's not good. Please understand this. It's a shit field. It's full of bullshit. It's full of shit artists. It's mediocre. It's worse than mediocre. And it's just not good enough. It's like, and people are still, you know, somehow they still think that they're brilliant, or that they're part of a sort of, they don't realize just how denigrated the whole thing is, just how pathetic the whole thing is. I mean, it's just, and I personally think it's because of the kinds of people that get into it. Is that I mean, in some sense, I think that what Sam Vaknin is actually outlining is just how decrepit the kinds of people are that get into psychology. You know, in terms of their, you know, it's an easy way to accrue prominence because you're in a field that is sort of by its nature prone to vague, nebulous, uh, uh, it's such it's such an undeveloped, sort of, and where is the interest in doing anything sort of radical and different and and research? It's sort of it's always gated behind you know because I mean it's the it's the patheticness of this field that allows, well, pharmaceuticals for one, to do whatever they want, which is also why the DSM even exists. We must not forget. I mean, this was essentially made for drug companies, um, to help them uh, market their drugs better and to create a kind of delineated targets for their development and patents. Um, it's an industry manual for actual industry, not for the psychological practitioners. Although I mean, it's sort of develop. I mean, it's not without its merits in terms of being able to use it as a way to correlate data and to correlate an advancement in understanding. But at some point, we just really have to see what a bad joke it all is, and how needed it is in a kind of fundamental reform and functionally a reincarnation. Psychology does need a reincarnation to get rid of exactly what Sam Vaknin is complaining about in this video. Um, Now, in some sense, like, perhaps I didn't do a good job of describing that reincarnation, but I mean, that's how I already think. That's how I already live in the reincarnated psychology, and I just look back at these people, and I just think, what a clown show, what a circus. So that's my uh, privileged view on the matter. Uh, I do feel that maybe Sam Vaknin goaded me a little bit because, I mean, talking about how borderline might become normalized. Well, I'm sure it can be. I'm sure it was normalized in fascist Germany, essentially. But I just don't think that those societies last very long. They're like the Mayan civilization. It comes to a kind of cataclysmic. Uh, anyway, I'm not even going to try to describe it, but basically, I think that those phases in culture are just not. They don't sustain themselves. Um, they can't reproduce themselves. And it has to do with kind of the reality tunnel of playing those trust games makes you functionally sort of, which is why in the West in general, um, those values have always been suppressed and have been successfully suppressed. And generally, to the extent to which that they exist within society, they've only existed within small subcultures and perhaps within a section of the female population, which is why I believe we had so much gender-based prejudice. It was a kind of is a firewall to stop the spread of those values, and then with the kind of egalitarianism that spread, the kind of the toxic fourth wave feminist version of egalitarianism, which was essentially to invoke this narrative of systemic oppression to explain any kind of statistical, I heard a good quote recently that statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. Uh, and that kind of distortion and selective honesty and profane dishonesty. Uh, anyway, I'm not going to repeat my rants. This is such an important subject. I'm going to add another recording to elaborate some important issues that I look. I mean, I realized, like, I really in the last recording it was really just an outline. So I think it's important for me to emphasize the main points. So I mean, and this I think is somewhat intellectually trite. This is quite obvious. Um, that the only way. Okay, well, first of all, psychology does have um, a dangerous influence over the use of its so-called expertise in judicial settings, and so that should at least be one warning sign that psychology needs to be reformatted or reformed in some way. And the only way to create a stable uh, uh, psychological literature that is, let's say, less problematic for the courts to digest and to sort of be, let's say, properly influenced by, is if psychology were restructured around an ethical framework that has to be grounded in actually a political um, a political philosophy in some sense. If it's not grounded, because essentially that's the biggest sort of problem in the relativism that psychology is prone to. It cannot be guided by the social norms. It has to be guided by something that's more structured and something that's more stable. It has to be grounded by something like an ethical, political sort of constitution that is somewhat immutable, that has general principles in it. And so it and then uh, perhaps not just political. When I say ethical, I mean also with a kind of a basic form of legal understanding and a basic form of some important legal concepts that have to be sort of underlined in the psychological literature or tracked or given some kind of ethical bearing within the psychological framework. um, because you have practices, you have psychological practices in many countries which are actually, you can only call them horror stories and monstrous. They do not respect the law. They do not respect the actual the rights of individuals. They have a kind of best practice which is so alien to the human society or the individual human interface with society. It's inhumane. It actually, it circumvents a kind of basic rights and dignity. I mean, it's actually monstrous. The level of sort of paternalism. that is, and then the courts have to play second fiddle in these aspects, because essentially somehow psychological ethics boards are higher than high courts or some shit like that, and this is a hideous position to be in, especially when high courts are meant to be able to uh, um, preside over any matter. Um, when they effectively sign over their jurisdiction to the annexation of this gang of uh, uh, or this mafia, sort of protection racket that covers itself in these convoluted diagnoses, which have not been structured, have not been ethically formatted in a way that is conducive to interfacing with uh, uh, a republic that is based on an open, liberal, democratic respect for rights of the individual, and for the mental integrity of the individual, um, and so this is why I think the question of, I still haven't remembered the term, but legal accountability, or legal responsibility, um, as a prime concept and notion, needs to be tracked very, very carefully from a set of principles, um, and that can only be done in an immutable way that is grounded, and that has some kind of political backbone in its outline of how to ground those concepts. And so the psychologist knows very well that yes, this person has a psychosis, but they have not lost their legal responsibility or accountability for being able to make legally binding decisions, and to indicate, uh, that their consent is still legally valid and binding. I can't remember what the name of the term is. Anyway, that is the important sort of thing, that psychology has to have sort of baked into its um, and there are horrible I mean, I'll give some examples of this, the horrible, let's just say, because I mean, I can just imagine the kind of screeching that will come out of some psychologists listening to me speaking. But there are historical examples which are even well known, which back me up in what I say. Imagine if John Stuart Mill lived today. Imagine if Wittgenstein lived today and went through a psychotic break, as they did go through psychotic breaks, and they were medicated with today's medication. They would have been ruined intellectuals. They would have never re entered circulation. They would have been dampened their entire life. They would have been put onto mood stabilizers and put onto antipsychotics, and it never would have ended. And they never would have been able to reconstitute their psychological schemas. I mean, Wittgenstein was essentially a completely different person after his psychological break. He was a different person because he reconstructed his own mentality. And if he was drugged under today's best practices, he probably would have just become a dazed sort of invalid, sort of burden to society, because the powers of the mind are not observed in current psychology, because the integrity of someone's own mentality is not respected. We live in a horror story. Please understand this. We live today in a field that is so poor and bad and weak. Uh, that this is denigration on a high scale, and the idea that this is not ripe and necessary to reform a broken system that is prone to this disgusting relativism. Now, this is also this relativism which Sam Vaknin outlines in this recording is what should essentially make any decent legal system think twice about any kind of expert evidence which is offered by any kind of person that has a psychological title attached to them. Um, Because if this relativism is baked into psychology, and it is, and that it doesn't have to be so. The field does not have to be grounded in these clouds, in these murky, muddy waters. It doesn't have to be this way. It just requires having a bit of a backbone, and it requires, you know, constructing something, as I said, from general principles, but which are going to have to somewhat be grounded in one eye on legal matters and legal distinctions that are important to preserve within the psychological literature, or at least to have underlined or correlated within the psychological literature, and one eye on a kind of political. And this is why I brought up permissiveness, because I think that, and you can call that a social norm, but you could also call it a liberal ideal, or a liberal value, that society should be as permissive as possible. And that does not mean to say that there are better practices, that there are better schemas, that there are better psychological structures for people to have that enhance their self empowerment, their self confidence, their self efficacy, their sense of responsibility. That there are matters between having an internal locus of control and an external locus of control. And yes, you can say, well, someone doesn't have to develop an internal locus of control if they have a conducive external authority in their culture or something like that. Now, and you can say, well, that's going to be culture bound, and that's going to lead to culture bound manifestations of certain syndromes, or certain kind of reactive, sort of participatory dampenings, or sympathetic structures which people are going to develop in parallel to these environmental influences. Uh, that being the case, I mean that doesn't mean that psychology has to be relativistic itself. It just means it has to be able to calibrate the kind of relativism in the manifestation of the structures that it's modeling, and that it's taking cognizant of. And in some sense, this just means that the purview of the clinician is going to have to be broadened, not to be according to societal norms at that time, a snapshot of what is normal and what is not normal, but it's going to have to do with the individual, that the patient. It's going to have to be, well, I can't just sell you a treatment. I have to actually bring you along into consenting to the diagnosis, basically having some form of a kind of informed consent that you should be treated for these structures which you have decided to get rid of, not because they are objectively pathological, because we live in a permissive society, but because they are, so this question of maladaption should not be standardized. Maladaption should be particularized into some kind of dialogue, into some kind of protagonistic inculcation of the patient. And if the patient is not willing to bite in on in to induct themselves into that kind of protagonist role within the therapeutic process, maybe they should not be therapized. Maybe they should not be inculcated into a new external locus of control under the auspices of the grand authority of the psychological establishment. How psychology sets itself up as a bastion of expertise is really toxic. It really is. And the field itself cannot mature because of this. The field itself cannot advance because of this, because it is addicted to its own false authority. It is the Pharisees of the modern times. It really is. And you can see this in the APA's endorsement of this kind of ideological Trojan horse complaining about toxic masculinity. And if it can be abused on that level, I mean, we have to recognize the warning signs. We have to recognize that the field is seriously broken. Uh, um, for it to be. I mean, how can it give an account of that level of abuse of so-called psychological knowledge and expertise? You know, it's obvious that the whole field needs to be reframed quite radically in order to disabuse it of this, because as a false authority, then it can be adopted by any ideology that wants its, that can line up its white lab coats to facilitate its Nazi culture or its fascistic identitarian, bullshit. You know, I'm quite appalled at just how psychology has bent over backwards to accommodate feminists and other identitarian fascistic types. Okay, anyway, and then I'll just there's another point. This is a small addendum. I said that no culture can last borderline that long, and I do think that needs some qualification, and it is perhaps even slightly wrong, because I was thinking in my mind there is actually a cultural example that I know of which has actually been able to sustain a borderline aspect in their culture, sort of like, and it's not really even a subculture because it's quite pervasive, but it's a very confusing example because it's hard to tell how much of this example is let's say is almost a naturally occurring phenomena because, okay, well, I'll just name the country and the culture is the mainland China, and I'll say specifically what it is. So look, I mean, obviously the history of China is incredibly um, potentially exogenous to endemic cultural evolution, having a communist revolution, having Soviet style propaganda, um, corroding institutions, um, but at least the borderline aspect to the culture, which is quite far reaching, sadly, is quite embedded in the current manifestation of the family in China. Um, for me, and I'll just explain what I mean. So basically, in terms of the parents' relationship to the children, the idea that sort of the children are an extension of facilitating even financially the comforts and convenience and the lives of their parents. That almost the children are this never-ending extension of their parents, uh, um, and that kind of sort of pick and choose. Um, I mean, I don't want to be too sort of pejorative, but just to relate it to borderline manifestations, that's the kind of trust parasitism, um, and in order to kind of sustain that feeling of of that trust is gated within a kind of familial context, it impoverishes the level of societal trust that can be cultivated. So there's no such thing as trust except for the kind of gated parasitic trust within the family unit. And this manifests also in very strange ways, in which, to the extent to which that there is a feeling of societal kinship that is very abstract, it's very uh, um, uh, things have been described in terms of the Chinese psyche, in terms of the glass heart, um, which is quite interestingly very basically identitarian in its psychological structure. That the pride of the identity and the collective identity is is a very sort of abstract notion, which is very sort of which is this, in terms of how people relate to it's both, it's very intimate and it's very superficial, and this actually was relevant in another one of my recordings, but I'm just going to say it here. It's quite interesting that what has basically been happening in the West in terms of identity politics is an imitation of Chinese culture to a large extent. That is the emergence of a kind of an induction of Chinese social values and in the West, um, which creates the same kind of reliance on a kind of political paternalism. That politics is there to guard the identity. Politics is there to secure the interests, the real interests that aren't national interests that can be understood secularly and being understood with a kind of secular politics, but are understood in terms of promoting the interests of the identity. And because that is based on a kind of very abstract symbolism, you can have a lot of corruption built into that, and it's basically undetectable because you can give people a wide berth, you can give people a very free hand because you know uh, um, symbolically enhancing the interests of the identity can mean anything and everything. It can be you can use it to disguise any activity. And so you can give the state a lot of power to do a lot of sophisticated things. And don't question it because it's part of the bigger tapestry of enhancing the identity. And so you're not given objective standards. You're not given sort of a transparent rule of law um, with which to sort of to look at these things. I mean, uh, and it's quite ironic when, for example, Trump is criticized for trousing the rule of law or something like that. When it's quite ironic that essentially uh, uh, Trump is more by the book than a lot of these ideologues would ever hope to be. Um, you know, Trump is very clearly within even the spirit um, of the Constitution and the outline of how the legal process works, whereas essentially these people that criticize him want to effectively change all the rules to suit their ideological whims. You know that they are quite happy um, radically recalibrating everything with just a kind of simple majority mandate that 50% plus one votes means that we can instantiate and we can make the law say what we want it to say. We can restructure anything that we want with just 50% plus one. That's really their mentality. um, which is this is the mentality of the Nazi state, that they just made the law to suit their ideological narrative. They they that's the extent that they if they have 50% plus one, whatever legal positivism, uh, they can just reformat the state as they so wish. Anyway, the hypocrisy. Okay, what else? Okay, so I was talking about China. I mean, I still think that it's unsustainable. I think that this culture will naturally choke itself. It'll self limit itself, and it'll be obvious that it's self limiting itself. I mean, if you look at the kind of sophisticated critiques that come out of Hong Kong of China, um, you, you I mean, you get a real sense at just how much China is arresting its own development by being part of this sort of promoting and perpetuating this kind of cultural mediocrity, and just how much internal damage is caused by sort of maintaining this kind of this somewhat borderline ethos, which infects um, sort of familial ties, but also this kind of detached relationship to society, which maintains a very sort of superficial sense of belonging, which is actually the obstacle or the hurdle displacing a deeper sense of participatory. Um, I mean, yeah, for me, it's all about the legal system. That if you that you and it's problematic because in the West there's so much of a Napoleonic legal system that you don't get a sense of how people can have a kind of a plenary lever over the rules that their society contains via the courts, and how their leveraging of general principles in their own individual morality can shape essentially the legal framework um, by developing a common law. Uh, I mean, on some level, it's not fair to also to contrast cultures that uh, have not organically developed with, let's say, more liberal forms of government. I mean, and also it's hard to tell what, let's say, the native culture was and how it would have naturally progressed um, with sort of better governmental frameworks. And I don't know enough about Taiwan in terms of because I mean, essentially, Taiwan, as far as I know, is the unadulterated Chinese culture that wasn't, let's say, uh, sort of ideologically wiped clean and sort of blanched by the basically a Soviet style social engineering. Taiwan is obviously a first world country and it has a democracy. It has a legal system that is slightly Napoleonic, but it's still it because it's such a small democracy. It's and it does have a kind of vibrant participatory sort of spirit. That sense of community, at least not on the individual scale, but at least in terms of so it's not completely disempowering of the individual. Although, as I say, I think that to the extent to which that you have any kind of Napoleonic stain in your legal system, I do think that that precipitates a kind of inexorable decline of the integrity of the individual as it becomes sort of orientated towards the moral authority that the state starts to accrue, uh, uh, and that culture that becomes a kind of a cultural object, which eventually ingrains a kind of subservience on the level of the individual integrity, um, and it somewhat cements or concretizes a kind of the feudalistic kind of worldview that you have this external locus of control where you expect to be socially engineered, where it's basically an illiberal culture. Never mind its window dressing, never mind its propaganda of what it says about it being a democracy. Essentially, it's just the tyranny of a majority. It's not what I would call an open liberal democracy. Um, and sadly, many Western countries have this. deficit. I only know of one country that conceptually doesn't have this deficit, but it has other problems in that it's been completely subverted by the identitarian fad and pseudo intellectualism that has basically corrupted South African politics, and it has caused the betrayal of the constitution, and the constitutional founding values have been radically reinterpreted to mean nothing. That they mean whatever the racialists want them to mean. I mean, that would be a nice movement. Not Black Lives Matter, but non-racialism matters. That would be a nice thing for people to say. No, I'm not going to kneel for Black Lives Matter because non-racialism matters more, and Black Lives Matter is not about non-racialism. It's poisonous, and my constitution is higher than your black fascism. Thank you very much. Um, so there's that. Yeah, certainly more could be said about how China, the culture of China, and how the West has actually been moving closer to China in terms of its. I mean, it is actually it is kind of the ideology. I mean, identity politics to some extent is the ideology that China is somewhat based on, because uh, it's just that they have a homogenous identity, so it's somewhat it's relatively stable. I mean, that's not exactly true, but it's true enough. Um, and then obviously, if you apply the same kind of ruling ideology to other states that are basically multiracial and multicultural, it's a because of the lack of homo- homogeneousness. It's just it's a bit of a nightmare because when you sort of remove real interests in a common citizenry, in a common vessel that the of of civil nationalism, when you essentially erode civil nationalism, but you promote essentially the real interests of the identity faction, and you're saying, you basically, this is the fascistic worldview, to look at society through the eyes of a kind of fascistic categorization of interests, um, and reduction of moral consideration into the cause of the identity. As soon as you accept that, I mean, you're basically, you have a fascistic worldview, and that is what identity politics promotes. It destroys common values. It destroys secular politics. It destroys democratic politics, um, and that is sort of where we are. And psychology, when psychology was associated with the general Western ethos of, let's say, liberal general principles, it was safe enough. I mean, obviously, it would have been nicer if this was ethically reasoned out very clearly and transparently, from first principles, and the whole thing was nicely tied up with a bow. Um, that would have been great. But it was, I mean, obviously, psychology does have to have wide enough room for people to disagree, and to have certain controversies, and things like that. Um, and it is true that in some sense, well, if you want to say, well, you can't have a stable psychology unless it's tethered to a political and sort of and sensitivity to certain legal concepts and distinctions that need to be preserved or correlated to the psychological literature, then there are obviously going to be people on the outside or on the other extreme where they're going to say, well, yes, I want to have an identity based psychology. I want to have a sort of a mythology. I want to it's the same way that the Nazis created their own sciences. That they created their own perversion of evolutionary thinking. Um, you're going to have the same identity pseudo intellectual scum. The identitarians are going to, create systems of psychological systemic oppression. They're going to weave their same ideological narrative in whatever material you give them free domain over corrupting. Um, but yeah, I mean that would be the only way to have a stable psychology, is to essentially have a very, what I would call, permissive, um, sort of political backbone in it, and supplement sort of clinical uh, intervention, or at least protocols for clinical intervention, um, with some kind of procedure. And it doesn't mean that that procedure won't be influenced by social norms, but at least then it will be contained. Um, this is the same way in which the Roman Dutch legal system um, has legal tests in it all over the place. It's littered. Their general principles have within them points at which they must have reference to social norms and social mores. That you can't just make legal decisions in a vacuum. And this also would make psychology much more robust, because then courts could have an evolving stance on psychological structures. Because it is for courts to change their decisions and to unfold the common law, and to and because a lot of these things are related to social mores. But then um, at least the psychological literature uh, uh, won't be this changing relativistic, sort of Picasso painting. Um, Psychology needs to learn how to digest its own Picasso painting uh, within its own sort of immutable ethical framework. And it perhaps needs to mirror things that are like a kind of judicial procedure, in terms of how they and you might find that these procedures then mean that the field has a kind of backbone, that it doesn't just fold when people say, no, this is the latest fashionable intellectual thing to say about transsexuality. Um, because, that is going to be, I mean, psychologists, in some sense, I hope many psychologists are taken to the cleaners at some point legally for their complicity into what has essentially been an identitarian ideological cult movement. Um, and what will their defense be? Their defense will be what some of the Nazis said. Oh, we were just following orders. We were just following the fashion. We were just following the fad. I think that this whole issue of relativism, but also this whole sort of problem that we culturally inhabit with identity politics, is a is perhaps an important catharsis of allowing us to upgrade and to reform these systems in our society, which were always missing a huge amount of integrity, and in need of serious remaking and restructuring. Um, and to the extent to which that the academy itself has also made itself prone to this kind of ideological cultism of the cause of the identity, just shows the kind of the feeble-minded people um, that inhabit, these gatekeeping roles, and how happy they are to cotton on to any sort of, because I mean, you can, it's a self-manufacturing industry. Um, because they can sort of endlessly create papers about exploring their imagination of systemic oppression, because the whole thing is fundamentally like hypothetical on the level of essentially just imagining a kind of trust parasitic. How do you structure a parasitic trust sort of involution? Um, you can paint that however you wish to. I feel like I need to perhaps delineate some of the issues around China, because it is a massive sort of subject. But uh, I mean, what I'm talking about when I call it like a borderline culture to some degree is almost that kind of fascistic um, trust parasitism, which then can facilitate propaganda um, that's supposedly promoting the identity or the interests of the identity. And obviously, the identity politics in China is very different from sort of the intersectional feminism form of identity politics, because um, there is only one identity, and then there is what is considered not that identity. It's not very. It doesn't. It's one thing. Whereas obviously intersectionality has many different identities, and so you don't quite see all the mechanics or the toxic mechanics of identity politics within the Chinese variant, because there is only one identity that matters, which is the Chinese identity. The sort of um, and its historical sort of mythology around it as well, which is obviously also a kind of historical residue, the kingdom under heaven. Um, but you can see also how this has evolved to some degree into the modern variant of state sovereignty, as it's many Asian countries, even Japan, sort of suffers from this hangover from history, that the state as an external locus of control, as a kind of parent to the identity, deserves its sovereignty because of its protectorship of the identity. And so it is a kind of ethnocentric sort of political constitution, de facto sort of constitution, and that constitutional power is basically paves the way for a kind of unaccountable state. I would say in Japan the state is slightly less unaccountable, but it is still a bit weird, because the Japanese state has for a long time been somewhat irresponsible. If you just look at the debt levels of the Japanese state, and essentially because of their cultural investment into state sovereignty, they will always bail the government out. So the government always has access to cheap debt to fund its unsustainable budget. So that's how it kind of manifests. So in some sense, Japan pays for its cultural proclivity to some degree, or it has to underwrite some faction of the population actually has to go toward um, propping it up. Uh, Whereas in China, it's a lot more perverse. The state sovereignty, because I mean, basically because of the lack of democratic accountability, essentially, um, and also the kind of the impoverishment of the political arena by essentially the identity politics that is used to supplement for genuine political, sort of. I mean, the problem is that you know the Communist Party in China has to sustain its power, its handle on power, and that requires this investment into this toxic identity sort of propaganda, um, which holds back politics and even the legal system from being able to develop in the way that it needs to develop in order to support a high functioning first world economy. The difference between a kind of middle income country and a middle income economy and a first world economy is uh, the independence of the judiciary and the sophistication of the legal framework, which China is not capable of developing because of essentially the kind of untoward allowances that need to be made in order for the reproduction of the Communist Party's power base. So the maintaining the power base of the Communist Party means that you can't have a sophisticated legal structure. Essentially, you have to be able to have these ad hoc. It's just like the Wild West. I mean, Hong Kong calls it people farming. That you create all these funds for people. You create all these sort of you give people credit and you let them create businesses and you let them create sort of intellectual property and business models, and then if any of them really take off, then the party comes in, or the government comes in and just takes it over, never mind what the contract actually says. The independent sort of business side of China is horribly strangled and dampened by, because I mean the biggest employer in China is the Communist Party, is the government. Like most people, when I say most, I just mean uh, not the absolute majority, but the biggest section of the population that is employed by anything is employed by the government. Um, I think it's like 1/3 of all businesses essentially are like state, and these are like middle class jobs, and essentially their dominance over industry to that degree, they orchestrate themselves like a kind of they don't allow competition with the state monopoly essentially. The competition that they do allow is very limited, and so the whole system is essentially held back by the need for the government to be the biggest employer, um, in order to keep its grip on power. Um, and yeah, that's going to, and that means that you can't have a sophisticated legal system because a sophisticated legal system won't be sensitive to that crude sort of reproduction of power. But anyway, so that's a very simple sort of narrative that perhaps even the many Chinese people can be happy with making that kind of sacrifice or something like that. I mean, the problem is that you don't see what you're losing out on. You don't see, where you could have been if you didn't have that kind of millstone around your neck. Um, but now, obviously, the identity politics in the West is much more toxic because it doesn't, the Chinese identity politics is just one identity that matters, and everyone shares that identity. And there's a lot of propaganda put into sustaining that identity and the interests of that identity. Whereas in the West, it's the same ideology, but you can see it in its dysfunction. You can see it in its destabilizing, sort of force. Um, Perhaps those also the dysfunctions are different because the one is happening on a very macro scale, and the other one is happening on a sort of on a micro scale, at the level at which everything is being broken down. Whereas in the Chinese system, only macro things are broken down, and everyone else just has to sort of live with these general conditions, which are quite broad. But the same sort of poison is happening in the West on a micro scale because of identity politics. Um, anyway, two windows on the same issue. It's sort of it's looking at two sides of the same coin, and so it's interesting to sort of to juxtapose at least, or to contrast those sorts of examples. But I mean, I would say that they're both examples of generally a kind of a borderline sort of culture. Um, and I'm not sure how traditional this culture really is. I think that it might be a kind of historical half breed, that it was is just a sort of the perfect storm of conditions of Soviet style ideology in social engineering, and sort of totalitarian political control over a country. Um, Hopefully, the leadership in China will revitalize Deng Xiaoping's vision, and sort of update it, um, in terms of trying to work out a stable political compromise in which the interests of the party um, is stably dissipated into a mature political political compromise. Uh, I mean, that would be the ideal. Who knows? But I mean, perhaps there is some room for maneuvering, because I mean, I have heard that there are places in China, provinces in China, where they undergo experiments, political experiments, in terms of, well, let's run this city like a democracy, and let's see how it functions. And but I think a lot could be learned from Hong Kong. Uh, anyway, but the thing that I wanted to say is that I think that, if this is a kind of historical sort of freak event that has precipitated this borderline culture, I do think that it isn't sustainable, and it does have this kind of voraciousness built into it, that it does at some point have to leverage scapegoats and antagonism in order to entrench its own internal cohesion. It does need to kind of create this parasitic environment of trust in order to underwrite its own validity. Um, and when your trust has been translated into a kind of parasitic sort of, then essentially you can only trust people to have trust around you or with you, that have a kind of a very superficial symbolic relationship, like immediate family, or like, you know or like the symbolism of the identity, and your relationship to a kind of political paternalism. So when you have a kind of parasitic trust in your culture, there's it requires a kind of parasitic paternalism to kind of undergird and um, stabilize your worldview, but also, how you mediate your relationship to your environment, how you psychologically model it, and how you interface with things. And I think a lot of people that come from Chinese families, or to some extent, uh, uh, some other Asian culture families, that um, that it is a pathological parental um, sort of it is inculcating values which are very debilitating. You know, they're somewhat and they have a kind of toxic overreach in sort of maiming what is possible within a kind of social uh, uh, a common social a structure that, you know, it puts blinders on people in terms of having a kind of a very horrible reality tunnel in terms of, because I mean essentially people are contained by their ability to develop trust, you know, and if you don't live in a high trust society, it's very hard to have a sophisticated first world economy, because you can't you can't have sophisticated contracts, you can't have sophisticated deals if you don't have an environment that is supportive of trust and cultivating trust and building trust. And when your trust is fundamentally affixed into kind of symbolism and the kind of narratives that identities are contained within, there is no there is no medium in which you can organize. There is no medium in which you can synthesize and integrate and network and coordinate. Coordination is fundamentally dampened into rudimentary, conventional, sort of inherited residues. You know, you need excuses. You need the excuse of an external threat in order to promote internal cohesion. You know, it's you become a completely sort of reactive automaton. You're always reacting to propaganda or conditions around the lever of the identity, and so, you know, you've got these sort of puppet strings attached to you, and you know, you can see this in the so-called left-wing Democratic Party identity politics. You know, you can see this kind of puppetry quite clearly. You can see it in the so-called fourth wave feminist intersectional whatever. Um, the need for an antagonist, the need for, you know, some form of parasitic trust. You know, this is why they also have their ideological cannibalism. You know, because they need to have, that's the only thing that gives them a kind of internal cohesion. Is a common enemy, is a common scapegoat, is a something to absorb their complaining. Um, this is why I think Noam Chomsky went completely off the deep end when he decided to try to refine these disgusting fascistic ideologues, and he thought that he could sort of give them enough guidance so that they could uh, uh, be be proactive in some direction. But, you know, they he doesn't realize how much he's dealing with. You know, there was a whole breed of Marxists who were basically fascists, who understood. They basically they stopped being communists, and they basically changed their allegiance to fascism, because they basically reinterpreted the Marxist analysis, and they said, yes, well, actually there will be a revolution and capitalism will sort of come to an end, but it's obviously going to be replaced by identitarian interests, basically. And that's sadly, they have been somewhat vindicated, but I mean, it doesn't mean that the proponents of this disgusting ideology, of this identitarian, you know, sort of monstrosity, um, don't have it wrong and aren't modeling something that I think fails the Marxist hypothesis, because they will just sort of re-engineer a form of feudalism. They have not resolved, they have not reached a proper synthesis of the issues, and they're just going to recreate feudalism with a new caste system, with their coordinating class of their elites that represent symbolically their identities, or something like that. Okay. This is yet another addendum. I just thought that this is a. I found a very good analog, I guess, to where I think psychology needs to sort of evolve, what it needs to evolve into, or toward, is that it should be couched in the same way that cosmetic surgery, um, what do you call it, elective cosmetic surgery, is ethically sort of grounded and outlined and framed. That we need that kind of procedure where, so that when people come with concerns, it's not a question of, no, I can't treat that, I can't help you with that because that isn't called pathological. That there is a variety of understanding structures, and that, obviously there are certain structures which are just not, let's say, about being adaptive, or that aren't just merely cosmetic, but they actually impact on functions. And so, you can perhaps, well, if we wanted to work on that or augment that, it's going to have ramifications and consequences, and there is some knowledge about how this might change how you interface with different spheres of how you relate to society or something like that. I mean, these are sort of fringe things, but but it that's the level at which things need to be pitched, I think, on at least in terms of some matters. But and you might find that an approach like that is actually much more um, enlightening in terms of the therapeutic process itself, because it really entrenches a kind of protagonism in the patient, that they are participating in a process, in a procedure, um, with their eyes open, and they're not dealing with this kind of this blinding authority that is also somewhat vested in safekeeping some snapshot of what the latest social norms are, as guarded by the psychiatrist or the psychologist. That there is a different kind of almost Socratic induction into um, therapeutic treatment, uh, uh, at least around grounding the concept of diagnosis, so that it's no longer um, this quite dehumanizing subject object sort of thing. I mean, obviously, there's permissiveness and there's permissiveness. Just because you have a politically permissive society doesn't mean that, obviously, certain conditions don't present themselves as dangers to other people, and there are certain conditions that have, certain propensities, which, there should be a duty or an ethical framework for the clinician to underscore, or to try to build those concerns as part of the kind of the Socratic dialogue, in terms of whatever inductive process there is, in terms of that these are important features that must be worked on. You don't want to get so cosmetically sort of in the cosmetic surgery analogy, you don't want to be so hypnotized by essentially just trying to um, facilitate the whim of the patient, to the extent to which that you are going to not inform him or her about the sort of incidental uh, uh, environmental complications which are associated with the path that they are indicating that they are interested in wanting to sort of proceed down. That essentially, if they want to become a better psychopath or something like that, you know there are situations in which, as a cosmetic surgeon would say, no, I'm not going to help you, um, in the same way a clinician should say, um, no, this is beyond my ethical purview, and and I probably could help with that, but it's wrong to do so. And because then you're dealing with someone, you can see that then the therapeutic alliance is based on a kind of um, a meeting of equals perhaps with different knowledge and different expertise, but in terms of the actual bond that the therapeutic alliance is forged out of, it's a different kind of animal, um, one that I think would be much more conducive to, in some sense, it would be roughly um, simulating, the kind of the platonic friendship of virtue in some sense. That would have to be somewhat of at least a component um, of the underlying theme that is being or is the conduit through which essentially the medicine of psychology is deployed and administered through. And this keeps things nicely above board. Um, Obviously, there are some conditions, and sadly, all of these conditions that are not amenable to this kind of therapeutic um, protocol or this rough outline are sadly also conditions that we don't really understand, or at least psychology at whole, roughly psychology doesn't really know what they're dealing with. They're just sort of, they're big question marks. So the only things that fall out of this rubric are um, and the borderline cases, which I mean that in two different ways in some sense, but the cases that are gray on this point, because they sort of, sometimes you can deal with them, or that you can seemingly deal with them as a person, and then sometimes they have this consistent uh, um, manifestation to get agitated or get into states that eventually precipitate psychosis. Those kinds of borderline cases, uh, I mean, well, at least in the case of borderline personality disorder itself, I mean, I think I've got a very good model of how those things are actually, how that sort of internal discombobulation is being essentially orchestrated in order to somewhat be a kind of broadcasting directorship and conditioning of the environment from the borderline. I mean, okay, you have to look at my other recordings, like specifically the one where I say the borderline does not have alloplastic defenses. The borderline is orchestrating and perpetrating a strategy of alloplasticity in order to meet their high demands of what is needed to facilitate their general schema. That they want to find a niche where they can perpetrate their ingrained structure, which they are contending, that they are covertly contending the strategy, um, and it has sort of it has layers of insulation, and that is even also being pre-selectively orchestrated. This is there's manipulation, there's dishonesty, there's selective honesty, there's convoluting issues, and there's this sort of creating these traps in which a kind of parasitic trust can emerge, and they can sort of attach to the emotional body of their codependent host, which is prone to them and prone to being fed a stream of their feelings, their sort of their unadulterated stream of consciousness, which the other person is made to be responsive to. And obviously there's a whole lot of decompartmentalization, which is part of that, because they have to condition someone to be responsive to their subjective reality, to their personal subjective interpretation. They need sort of, it's in the same way that when a child is having a temper tantrum, they're absorbing attention. It's really the same. Uh, and it's interesting because it's more insidious than that, because it's not as if they don't have an adult ego. They actually do have an adult ego. It's just at the behest of their inner child sort of strategy. Um, it's a shell game for them essentially, which is also why they precipitate different valences. But anyway, and they can just reiterate certain tactics and certain, you know, they've got sort of, there's always the kind of the carrot and the stick in terms of how they're conditioning their host to be responsive to their uh, what I can only describe as a kind of solipsism. Um, and sort of the byproduct of this is just a kind of that the concept of trust is just used as a kind of parasitic resource, and it's the rehabilitation and their being able to navigate life from an independently contended trust, that they will cultivate their own trust and they'll be responsible for curating the notion of trust, um, and tracking it, and being accountable for repairing their model of what they can trust. But instead, they don't want to track what they should trust. Instead, they want to collectivize trust as a kind of narrative that then they get somebody else to process by forcing someone to be prone to their subjective stream of consciousness. So they always have this kind of psychological penetration, which they need access to somebody else's emotional body in their adult ego, so that they can take over somebody else's emotional body and make their ego function, essentially perform services to their emotions. So they have a kind of external ego function. Um, and then they can leverage that external locus of control to absorb whatever accountability they don't wish about the outcomes of their own decisions. So they can make whatever gambles they so wish, and if they don't get the outcome that they wanted, they can always just blame it on the failed parentage that they were extracting from their host. Anyway, what's even worse is that there are clinicians, there are people in psychology who are sort of cluster B themselves, and essentially they get into concocting, some variant of the therapeutic alliance, because it enables them to exercise this kind of puppetry, this kind of puppet master, the levers over other people, which is also why I can imagine that when I describe these alternative models of psychology, I can just hear the screeching. I can hear the pseudo intellectual over rationalization of why, it's and I mean, yes, there are certainly going to be some cases in which I mean, again, I don't really see what progress you're going to make if you're going to take a kind of authoritarian role over a certain case, except to impose exercises and behaviors which are going to have a restorative, palliative, convalescent uh, uh, process. And so essentially, the only reason why I think you would take an authoritarian stance in a case is because you need to control certain conditions in order to precipitate enough of a of an of a rehabilitated sense of individual protagonism, an internal, you have to control the conditions well enough to rehabilitate a sense of um, uh, uh, conscious decision making, or somewhat stabilize things well enough so that they can sort of get a handle on their ego function. Anyway, so I'm not saying that they won't be cases in which uh, sort of interventionary um, steps wouldn't be required in order to help resolve uh, a persistent, let's say, emergency. Uh, but sadly, too much can be relegated under that semantic, under that label, and then you've deployed more hideous. You've just got a sort of a more sophisticated maze of obstacles to circumvent in order to orchestrate the same kind of psychological sort of unjustifiable conceit, uh, which is certainly not justified when one understands the level at which psychology is at. Uh, and this perhaps gets even harder when you're dealing with statistics, when you're trying to manage statistical risk, and when you're effectively being compelled by best practices which are informed by epidemiology. Um, I think there are huge ethical problems. Uh, you can understand why they might arise, or where they come from, but this my sympathy really does not extend too far, because this is a deep philosophical question that has not been properly thought through, and because it's been fudged, because it's just been sort of the earliest excuse has been taken to create a kind of conventional best practice that no, we look at the statistics and we make the decision because that's what responsibility means. That's what it means to have integrity as a psychological practitioner or something like that. And because that orthodoxy and that dogma has essentially been ingrained into the field, that now, based on that assumption, based on that very bit of tenuous, and I might even say sordid, sort of set of equivocations and set of weak inductive reasoning, that then one self-assures psychology that no, you're doing the best for the patient by being a and I just want, perhaps there are some ways of getting through this. I mean, there are some measures to to appease some of the standards that I am outlining, which have been forgotten by a decadent field, where you could come to points at which you deliver ultimatums to the patient, where you say, well, if you can stop doing just this behavior, then we will listen to your direction about whether you take medication or not. That you can reject medication if you stop doing this behavior. You know, and we've never seen that kind of introduction of ultimatums into processes, into treatment processes. Um, it's because that would be much too complicated for practitioners. Never mind, because the legal headache is already a huge headache, so it's already too hard. So they just must know that their best practice is legally covered, and they can do whatever they want, and they can treat their patient however they so wish. So I mean, this is, yes, it is a complicated matter, and they will have to be sort of decision trees. There will have to be treatment trees or whatever, procedural protocols that exist on trees in which there is a correct path that where essentially that the patient can track that their actions have triggered an escalating, let's say, response of involuntary commitment, but that there is within that tree um, a certain rehabilitative procedure in which growing respect um, is procedurally recovered um, for the decision making integrity of the patient. Uh, and essentially, that tracking the protagonism of the patient as also the core of the psychological, let's say, identity or entity that is the thing that is supposedly being treated. Is the thing. They think, oh, we're treating you um, in an objectified sense because we have so much respect for for your individual your individualism. It's a paradox, and the extent to which that this paradox has not been elaborated and unwound in such a way that it's been overridden uh, by so-called expertise in a field that cannot claim to have expertise at the level at which that it exists, um, or that it subsists at the moment. These are deeply ingrained inconsistencies and, dare I say it, even also hypocrisy, which has gone unexamined for too long, and it's gone unresolved for too long because the field itself has allowed itself to be prone to a relativism to try to cover itself, to cover over its laxness, to cover over its ethical failings. Um, and at the point at which that we do eventually reform psychology, we will have to even say, well, even 15 years ago, even 5 years after the reform is done, we will have to immediately say, well, before these new protocols and procedures and framework was developed, we have to recognize that essentially we were perpetrating criminal activities that really, psychiatry and psychology really will have to be associated with a deep stain of criminality um, that has been perpetrated on our society uh, and on individuals specifically, and that kind of criminality was overlooked uh, to our shame, to our collective shame, um, that this was not uh, uh, that this had not come to a head sooner, that we had not examined this sooner. And dare I say it, that it's even been this lax treatment, or this lax, let's say, moral foundation in psychology, which has also let the devil creep in terms of the ideological confusions and the ideological Trojan horse that psychology has become. When I describe the APA and the toxic masculinity identity bullshit, you know, that this is how science has become vulnerable to essentially masking the latest fascistic political ideology called identity politics. And uh, perpetrate the fraud that is required in order to sustain this kind of the pseudo intellectual bubble. Um, okay, I guess that's the end of my rant. Yeah, I feel quite remiss because I actually am sitting on about, I think, about 5 hours or 6 hours of recordings about my metagram modeling, which I haven't released yet because I still haven't gotten over the embarrassing things that I said in my latest re- release about some of the things that I was speculating on. But honestly, I don't really want to go much further on metagram. The problem actually is I don't have the resources. I need to print out things so that it's easier for me to. Uh, anyway, I need to find a team of people that would be willing to go down this rabbit hole with me, I guess. But yeah, no, I am getting very close in decoding the 17 model in relation to the emotional tones. Which I've been avoiding looking at it for just forever. But when those two models have been completely reconciled, then I'll have a very clear picture of everything that's happening in the field, and I'll be able to create a very transparent philosophical overview of the whole structure and the whole of all the different models within the structure of metagram and metatype. Um, yeah, it's the most complicated thing is in. I can't even describe it verbally because it's so weirdly complicated. I think there is room for me to. I'm hoping that the red thread and the green thread within the 17 model might be an aspect of the definitional components of the emotional tones. And as soon as I can decode the emotional tones within the 17 model perfectly and know how they correspond, that would give such a laser precision to understanding the contents of each component of the false ego complex, because then you'd be able to map specifically, um, the resolution on the content of the emotional tone happening within a certain element of the false ego complex would allow one to treat that issue with a kind of laser precision, with a kind of philosophical maneuvering. It would make it would and then also in terms of how the emotional tones have their own circuitry that they're attached to independently of the circuitry in the false ego complex, would probably very clearly indicate which emotional tones would be the appropriate therapeutic. You would be able to extract some kind of description of therapy from the use of emotional tones to ameliorate or to sort of or to balance, to sort of massage the that section of the false ego complex, which then would allow essentially you to, what would come into view is that then you would gain access to deeper, um, so you would be able to discharge the the kind of the entanglement one has to certain elements within the false ego complex, and then one would be able to eventually deal with the deeper structures in the false ego complex until eventually being able to attend to the prime truth, which the false ego complex is centered around um, manufacturing, which is a bit complicated because that truth is also sort of embedded in a kind of dialectical. Um, it's always created by at least two bodies. Um, in that you have a kind of environmental false ego as well, um, because then your first self image is the reaction to the environmental reading of it. So you kind of snapshot the environment and you create a narrative within which the self image operates. So there's and that environmental false image, or that environmental false ego section of the false ego is very problematic because it was not consciously, it eventually becomes precipitated, and it eventually becomes, it comes into focus after the self image is fully developed and elaborated, and then also the complication is that that false ego develops an adult ego, and so usually people are sequestered in the adult ego, and that inner child becomes unconscious, and the environmental ego is completely, um, was never even conceived of. So it's like the shadow of the shadow. It's but then when one revisits these things, one has to deal with a section of the false ego which was never consciously organized. It was never decided into being. It precipitated via the original contract, as I call it, the original false ego contract. Um, and so anyway, I'm not really in that wavelength right now to talk about these sorts of things, but the emotional tone aspect of that might give very clear indications as to, at least thematically, how to manage those emotional tones, or at least, obviously, you don't necessarily, you can't necessarily directly manage the emotional tone, but the emotional tone will be associated with some content, with some inclination, with some decision, with some subconscious impression, um, depending on which element within the false ego you're talking about. But in some sense, the emotional tones themselves, I've also said, are generally speaking, they are figments, or they are models that are actually fundamentally to do with the subconscious and unconscious schema, uh, because that is actually the core and the root of how the false ego complex operates. It doesn't operate. It's a you know I had to create the emotional tones or model the emotional tones because the actual substance of the false ego complex um, is a set of dispositions which are unknown even to the original self image because half of them um, are contextualized by the environmental false ego. Um, and so you've got a kind of drama of dispositional impingement, uh, uh, which I mean, I've said the only way that you can actually understand, or the only way that you can philosophically kind of aggregate this is that it's basically in the belief that there's an external process and an external locus of control, which is kind of like an infinite flux. It's like an infinite river, and that it's kind of very much like the kind of what are they called again? Perennialist. It's very similar to a kind of perennialist, sort of theology. Doesn't really believe that there's anything within the mind that is worthy of sort of being able to manifest a kind of sovereignty and an internal locus of control. It sort of believes that we are somewhat beyond, uh, that we just have to find ourselves huddled under some kind of external locus. Anyway, but yeah, and the 17 model is basically a phenomenological sort of system of epistemology, and without that uh, canonic, I mean, it's based on sort of a grammar theory, mental grammar, I guess you could say, but it also works for grammar, but grammar as in meaning. Uh, so it's a model of it's basically an epistemological model um, of both the mind and also reality, or this phenomenology. And because of its comprehensive basis, then I'm able to track everything and model everything. So I mean, that's basically what the whole system. If you don't have that kind of robust theoretical framework at the outset, you have no hope of doing anything interesting or useful in psychology. You can't do anything in psychology if you're just going to uncover it sort of inductively, empirically from the outside. If you don't already have a very robust, uh, elaborate um, psychological framework, you just, I don't know what you're doing, but you're wasting everyone's time. And I guess you are interested in um, epidemiology is all you really sorry, epiphiliology. Yeah. So anyway, this is, I guess, just to put it out there that I have a system that I've been working on for now 28 years, uh, from the age of 7. Because I guess someone had to do it. But anyway, let me just end this embarrassing recording. But I guess that at least rounds out my alternative to where psychology must be reformed. That as like going to a cosmetic surgeon, you want to augment something about your psychology or something related to a psychological matter. And that augmentation then is subject to some kind of um, dialogue, at least a kind of a protocol in which there's a kind of um, and I mean, I think, well, to a large extent, I think psychology has been missing this really robust, sort of positive psychology aspect, which is you're not capable of really contending, I think, a meaningful positive psychology until there is a groundwork, until there is a kind of an ethical framework to sort of to erect it from, and yeah, which essentially means that at some point we have to deal with this relativism problem, and we have to deal with it seriously, and we have to notice that it is poisonous and we have to get rid of it. Uh, and at the same time, we'll be getting rid of a lot of rubbish, which will be good.